In May of 1939, medical records at Hospital de Pisco in Peru documented an emergency admission that would defy every known boundary of human biology. A 5-year-old girl named Lina Medina arrived with severe abdominal swelling that physicians initially diagnosed as a massive tumor. What Dr. Gerardo Lozada discovered during his examination would become one of the most disturbing cases in medical history, a mystery that would haunt generations to come. Before we dive into the story, if you're drawn to uncovering the darkest corners of human history, the cases that challenge everything we think we know about innocence and evil, then click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Comment your country and your local time. I love knowing where everyone's tuning in from. Now let's continue with the story. The village of Ticrapo clung to the Andean mountainside like a forgotten prayer, a place so remote that even government census takers rarely made the journey. During the bitter winter of 1939, frost settled into the valley each night as the Medina family began to notice something troubling about their youngest daughter. Lina, barely 5 years old, had begun to show unusual swelling in her abdomen that grew more pronounced as the months passed. Victoria Medina, the child's mother, initially blamed susto, a folk illness said to come from sudden fright or spiritual imbalance. The village curandera prepared herbal remedies from mountain plants, burning offerings to the apus, the protective mountain spirits that governed life in these isolated communities. When these traditional treatments produced no improvement, Victoria wondered if her daughter had contracted the parasitic infections that plagued children in the high-altitude settlements, where clean water remained scarce and medical knowledge consisted of remedies passed down through generations. Tiburelo Medina, a silversmith who crafted religious items for the small church in Ticrapo, watched his daughter's condition with growing alarm. By April of 1939, Lina's abdomen had swollen to such proportions that the child could no longer play with her siblings or walk without discomfort. The other children in the village had begun to whisper and stare, their parents pulling them away when Lina approached, as if whatever afflicted the girl might prove contagious. The decision to seek medical attention in Pisco required resources the family could barely afford. Tiburelo sold several of his finest silver pieces to merchants in the nearest market town, gathering enough money for the journey down from the mountains. On a morning when clouds hung low over the peaks, he lifted his daughter onto his back and began the descent along narrow paths that wound through terrain where a single misstep could prove fatal. Lina, weakened by her condition, clung to her father's shoulders as they traveled for 2 days, sleeping in caves and accepting food from families in small settlements along the route. When they finally reached the coastal town of Pisco, the contrast between mountain and shore struck them immediately. The humid air, the Spanish colonial architecture, the bustle of a community connected to the outside world through roads and telegraph lines, all of this represented a reality foreign to their highland existence. Tiburelo carried Lina through streets where modern buildings stood alongside centuries-old churches, searching for the hospital that locals had directed him toward, unaware that within hours, his family's tragedy would become a case studied in medical journals across the world. Dr. Gerardo Lozada had practiced medicine in Pisco for nearly 2 decades, treating everything from tropical fevers to industrial accidents from the nearby fishing port. When the Highland silversmith carried his daughter into the hospital reception area that afternoon, the physician assumed he would be diagnosing another case of the abdominal tumors that occasionally afflicted children in isolated communities where malnutrition and parasitic infections created perfect conditions for such growths. The examination room smelled faintly of carbolic acid and sea air drifting through open windows. Lina lay on the table, her tiny frame dwarfed by the swelling that distended her abdomen to an almost grotesque proportion. Dr. Lozada began with standard palpation, his experienced hands mapping the contours of what he expected to find. Within seconds, his expression changed. The mass felt firm and structured, not at all like a tumor. As he traced its shape, an impossible realization began to form. He stepped back from the table and asked Tiburello to wait outside. The silversmith hesitated, protective instincts warring with respect for medical authority, but eventually complied. Once alone with the child and a nurse, Dr. Lozada performed a more thorough examination. His hands trembled slightly as he confirmed what his initial assessment had suggested. He called for his colleague, Dr. Rolando Coloreta, to provide a second opinion, unwilling to trust his own diagnosis of something that violated every principle of pediatric medicine. Dr. Coloreta arrived within minutes, and after his own examination, the two physicians stood in stunned silence. They ordered X-ray imaging, a rare technology in provincial Peru. The radiography equipment, recently installed with government funding meant to modernize regional healthcare, had never been used for a case like this. As the photographic plates developed in the darkroom, both doctors understood they were about to confirm a biological impossibility. The X-ray images revealed a fully formed fetal skeleton. The bones showed development consistent with approximately 7 months of gestation. Dr. Lozada counted the vertebrae twice, examined the skull formation, measured the femur length against standard growth charts. Every measurement confirmed what seemed medically absurd. Medina, aged 5 years and 7 months, according to the birth certificate her father had presented, was in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. The physician summoned additional specialists from the hospital. Within hours, 5 doctors had examined the child, each hoping to find an error in the previous assessments. They measured her height at 109 centimeters, her weight at approximately 27 kilograms, accounting for the pregnancy. They noted her physical appearance remained entirely that of a young child, her face still possessing the rounded features of early childhood, her limbs showing none of the lengthening associated with approaching adolescence. Dr. Lozada faced the difficult task of informing Tiburello. The silversmith initially refused to believe the diagnosis, insisting the doctors had made a mistake, that his daughter was merely ill with some mountain sickness the coastal physicians did not understand. When Dr. Lozada showed him the X-ray images, explaining in careful detail what the skeletal structures represented, Tiburello's face transformed from confusion to horror, to a rage that required 3 orderlies to restrain. The hospital administrator arrived to manage the situation, understanding immediately that this case carried implications far beyond standard medical treatment. He ordered the X-rays secured in the hospital safe and instructed the staff to maintain absolute discretion. News of such a case would create scandal, raise questions that would devastate the family, and potentially expose the hospital to unwanted scrutiny from authorities and press alike. That evening, Dr. Lozada sat in his office reviewing medical literature, searching for any documented case of pregnancy at such an age. He found references to precocious puberty, rare instances where children developed sexually years before the normal time frame. The youngest documented case of menarche he could locate occurred at 1 year of age, recorded in a European medical journal from 1884. But pregnancy required not just early menstruation, but sexual violation of a child who could not possibly consent or even comprehend what was happening to her. The question that haunted him as he closed the medical texts was not how this pregnancy was biologically possible, but who had done this to a 5-year-old girl, and whether that person still had access to her. He made a decision that would prove controversial among his colleagues, but which his conscience demanded. He contacted the local police prefecture and reported a case of suspected child sexual assault. The investigation he set in motion would consume the next several weeks, though its results would ultimately satisfy no one seeking justice for what had been done to Lina Medina. 3 specialists arrived from Lima on the overnight train, summoned by telegrams that described only an unprecedented obstetric case requiring immediate consultation. Edmundo Escomel, the most prominent endocrinologist in Peru, led the team that descended upon Hospital de Pisco with the gravity of men approaching a medical phenomenon that would define their careers. What they discovered in the small examination room would challenge their understanding of human development in ways no textbook had prepared them for. The medical examination conducted over the following 48 hours revealed a body caught between 2 impossible states. Dr. Escomel documented that Lina had experienced her first menstrual period at 8 months of age, an occurrence so rare that fewer than a dozen cases existed in global medical literature. Her mother, Victoria, confirmed this detail reluctantly, explaining that the family had consulted the village curandera about the bleeding, attributing it to an injury or spiritual curse rather than biological development. Physical examination showed breast development consistent with Tanner stage 4, typical of a girl in mid-adolescence. Her bone age, assessed through X-rays of her hand and wrist, measured approximately 9 years, despite her chronological age of 5. Hormone panels revealed testosterone and estrogen levels, matching those of a sexually mature female. The pituitary gland, for reasons medical science could not adequately explain, had triggered puberty years before the hypothalamus should have initiated such processes. Dr. Escomel spent an entire afternoon reviewing similar cases documented in European and American medical journals. He found references to precocious puberty in children as young as 2 years old, cases where tumors on the adrenal glands or ovaries had secreted hormones that forced premature development. But Lina showed no evidence of such tumors. Her condition appeared to be idiopathic, arising from no identifiable cause, simply a catastrophic failure of the body's normal developmental timeline. The physicians faced an ethical labyrinth. Standard medical protocol required thorough documentation, yet photographing a pregnant 5-year-old raised profound moral questions. They compromised by taking clinical photographs that showed only her abdomen and skeletal X-rays, images that would later appear in medical journals with careful cropping to protect her identity. Dr. Lozada insisted these records served a purpose beyond scientific curiosity. They documented a crime against a child who could not speak for herself. Neurological assessment revealed normal cognitive development for her age. Lina could count to 20, recognized basic colors and shapes, and spoke in simple sentences mixing Spanish and Quechua. When doctors asked about her condition, she touched her swollen belly and said it hurt to walk. When they asked gentler questions about her life in Ticrapo, she described playing with dolls made from corn husks and helping her mother grind maize. She displayed no understanding of pregnancy, reproduction, or what was happening inside her body. The psychological evaluation, conducted by a psychiatrist from Lima's Hospital Dos de Mayo, noted significant dissociation when certain topics arose. Any questions about adults who might have touched her or hurt her produced blank stares or sudden changes in subject. The psychiatrist documented this response as consistent with severe trauma in young children, where the mind protects itself by refusing to process or recall experiences too overwhelming to integrate. Whether Lina genuinely could not remember her assault, or had buried the memory so deeply that it became inaccessible, remained unclear. Dr. Escamel published his findings in the Peruvian medical journal, La Presse Médicale, carefully omitting identifying details while describing the biological mechanisms that made such a pregnancy possible. His article sparked immediate controversy. Several prominent physicians questioned the authenticity of the case, suggesting photographic manipulation or misdiagnosis. Others demanded more evidence before accepting claims that contradicted established understanding of human sexual development. The debate within medical circles created pressure for additional verification. The Peruvian Academy of Medicine convened a special panel to review all documentation. 5 additional physicians examined Lina, each confirming the pregnancy and the precocious puberty that enabled it. Their collective report, filed with government health authorities, transformed the case from medical curiosity into official record, a document that would survive in archives long after those who created it had died. Yet all this clinical investigation, this meticulous documentation of biological anomaly, skirted the fundamental horror at the heart of the case. Somewhere in Ticrapo, or along those mountain paths, or perhaps within Lina's own household, an adult had sexually assaulted a child whose body had betrayed her by maturing just enough to conceive. The medical establishment could explain how pregnancy occurred, but they seemed far less interested in discovering who had caused it. The police prefecture in Pisco assigned Inspector Julio Hurtado to investigate the assault, a task that proved far more complex than any case in his 20-year career. Within days of Dr. Lozada's report, officers traveled to Ticrapo with a mandate to identify the perpetrator and gather evidence for prosecution. What they encountered in the mountain village was a wall of silence so impenetrable that even direct questioning yielded nothing but evasive stares and claims of ignorance. Inspector Hurtado arrested Tiburelo Medina on the 5th day of investigation, acting on the grim statistical reality that most child sexual abuse occurs within families. The silversmith spent 3 weeks in custody at the Pisco jail, subjected to interrogations that grew increasingly aggressive as investigators struggled to break through his denials. He maintained absolute innocence, insisting he had no knowledge of how his daughter became pregnant, and suggesting that perhaps the medical diagnosis itself was mistaken. The case against him disintegrated under scrutiny. Several villagers provided statements confirming that Tiburelo had been absent from Ticrapo for extended periods during the previous year, traveling to markets in Huancayo and Ayacucho to sell his silverwork. The timeline of Lina's pregnancy, calculated backward from the fetal development observed in X-rays, suggested conception occurred during one of these absences. The prosecutor reviewing the case found insufficient evidence to proceed to trial, and Tiburelo was released with warnings that the investigation would continue. Inspector Hurtado expanded his inquiry to include other men who had access to the Medina household. He questioned neighbors, relatives, and the village priest who occasionally visited remote settlements to perform baptisms and marriages. Each interview produced the same result: shocked denials, suggestions that perhaps the child had been violated during one of the religious festivals when strangers passed through Ticrapo, or quiet implications that mountain spirits rather than human agency might explain such an impossible pregnancy. The cultural barriers proved as formidable as the geographic isolation. Many villagers spoke primarily Quechua, requiring translators whose loyalty to community cohesion outweighed any commitment to justice for one child. Inspector Hurtado noticed how questions about Lina prompted subtle changes in demeanor, a collective closing of ranks that suggested knowledge being deliberately withheld. Whether this silence protected a specific individual or simply reflected unwillingness to cooperate with coastal authorities, who rarely intervened in Highland affairs, remained unclear. Victoria Medina refused to speak with investigators after the initial questioning. She had returned to Tecrapo briefly to gather belongings before joining her husband and daughter in Pisco, and during that visit, villagers made clear that continued cooperation with police would result in social ostracism. The Medina family depended on community support for survival in the harsh mountain environment. Trading that security for an investigation unlikely to succeed represented an impossible choice. The case files, preserved in the Pisco Prefecture archives, documented dead end after dead end. Investigators considered the possibility that Lina had been assaulted by someone outside the family during one of the village festivals, where drinking and reduced supervision created opportunities for predators. They examined records of transient workers who had passed through the region, men hired for road construction or mining operations who might have encountered the child. Every lead dissolved upon examination, leaving only speculation and suspicion without evidence sufficient for prosecution. By late April of 1939, Inspector Hurtado acknowledged the investigation's failure in his official report. He noted the extreme difficulty of gathering evidence in remote communities, the lack of witnesses willing to testify, and the absence of physical evidence that might identify the perpetrator. The prosecutor formally suspended the case while keeping it technically open, a bureaucratic compromise that allowed authorities to claim continued diligence while effectively abandoning hope of justice. Dr. Lozada read the inspector's report with bitter frustration. The medical community had documented every biological detail of Lina's condition with scientific precision, yet the legal system proved incapable of answering the most essential question: who had done this to her? The failure haunted him as he prepared for the next phase of this unprecedented case, the delivery of a baby from a body that should never have been capable of conceiving one. Justice might elude them, but he was determined that both mother and child would survive the birth that medical textbooks said should be impossible. As Lina's pregnancy advanced into its final weeks, Dr. Lozada assembled a surgical team for what would be the most controversial operation in Peruvian medical history. Natural delivery was anatomically impossible. At 5 years old, Lina's pelvis measured barely 7 centimeters at its widest point, less than half the diameter required for an infant to pass through the birth canal. Cesarean section represented the only viable option, though performing major abdominal surgery on such a small child carried risks that kept the surgeon awake through several sleepless nights. The hospital administrator secured additional blood supplies from donors in Lima, anticipating complications that might require transfusion. Anesthesia presented particular challenges. The doses required to keep an adult unconscious during surgery could prove fatal to a child's smaller body mass, yet insufficient anesthesia risked her waking mid-procedure. Dr. Alberto Cáceres, the hospital's most experienced anesthesiologist, spent days calculating precise measurements, consulting colleagues in the capital about protocols for pediatric patients undergoing major surgery. On the morning of May 14, 1939, Lina was prepared for the operation. Nurses had bathed her the night before, speaking gently as they washed her swollen belly, treating her with the tenderness normally reserved for frightened children facing tonsillectomies. She had eaten nothing since the previous evening, per surgical protocols, and complained of hunger as orderlies wheeled her gurney toward the operating theater. Victoria walked alongside, holding her daughter's small hand, until the doors to the surgical suite closed between them. Dr. Lozada made the first incision at 9:37 in the morning, according to the surgical notes preserved in hospital archives. He worked with Dr. Busolo, a visiting obstetrician from Lima, who had assisted with hundreds of cesarean deliveries, but never one under such circumstances. The MO, scalpel cut through skin, subcutaneous tissue, and the fascial layers that protected the abdominal cavity. Both surgeons worked with meticulous care, aware that one error could kill both mother and child. The uterus, enlarged to accommodate a full-term fetus, dominated Lina's small abdominal cavity. Dr. Lozada made the uterine incision with hands steady, despite the weight of what this moment represented. At 9:51, he lifted a crying infant from the womb of a 5-year-old girl, an act that seemed to violate natural law itself. The baby boy weighed 2.7 kilograms, his lungs producing healthy cries that filled the operating room with sound that should never have existed. Nurses cleaned the newborn and recorded his vital signs, while Dr. Lozada focused on closing the surgical site. The operation lasted 73 minutes, from first incision to final suture. Throughout the procedure, Lina's vital signs remained stable, her young body demonstrating resilience that surprised even the experienced surgical team. Dr. Caceres maintained anesthesia at levels that would allow her to wake within the hour, free from the trauma of consciousness during surgery. Victoria and Tiburello chose to name the infant Gerardo, honoring the physician who had protected their daughter when authorities could not. The boy showed no complications from his extraordinary birth, his APGAR scores indicating normal health despite emerging from a womb that should not have existed in a child's body. Nurses placed him in an incubator as a precaution, monitoring his temperature and breathing through the first critical hours. Lina woke in the recovery room confused and in pain. The surgical incision across her lower abdomen would heal over the following weeks, leaving a scar she would carry for the remainder of her life. When nurses brought baby Gerardo to her, she looked at him with the curious detachment of a child presented with a living doll. She had carried him for 9 months, felt him moving inside her body, and now he existed as a separate being whose cries demanded attention she had no context for providing. Dr. Escamel examined both mother and child 2 days after the surgery, documenting their conditions for the medical report he would publish in international journals. Lina showed normal post-surgical recovery for a patient her size. Gerardo fed well and gained weight appropriately. The biological success of the delivery stood in stark contrast to the moral catastrophe that had made it necessary. Medical science had achieved the impossible, delivering a healthy baby from a 5-year-old mother, but no amount of surgical skill could repair the violation that had created this situation. Dr. Escamel's article in La Presse Médicale reached international medical communities within weeks, and by June of 1939, newspapers from New York to Buenos Aires carried headlines about the youngest confirmed mother in recorded history. The Associated Press dispatched correspondents to Pisco, offering substantial sums for photographs and exclusive interviews. What began as a medical case study transformed into a media sensation that threatened to consume the Medina family entirely. A circus promoter from California arrived at Hospital de Pisco with a contract promising $10,000 for a 6-month exhibition tour across North America. He envisioned Lina and baby Gerardo displayed behind velvet ropes, with medical explanations provided between shows and photographs sold to audiences eager to witness biological impossibility made flesh. Dr. Lozada refused to allow the man past the hospital reception area, instructing security to escort him from the premises and bar his return. Film producers followed, representatives from Hollywood studios, convinced that Lina's story possessed commercial potential. They proposed dramatizations, documentaries, and educational films that would ostensibly raise awareness about child abuse while generating profits from public fascination with the case. One producer suggested hiring a young actress to portray Lina, arguing this approach would protect the real child while satisfying audience demand for her story. Each proposal shared the same underlying motive: to turn tragedy into entertainment. The Medina family, overwhelmed by attention they never sought and could not escape, retreated further from public view. Tiburello refused all interviews, his earlier openness with medical professionals replaced by deep suspicion of anyone asking questions. Victoria shielded Lina from journalists who loitered outside the hospital, some attempting to bribe nurses for information or photographs. The family received threatening letters alongside the commercial offers, messages from religious extremists who viewed Lina's pregnancy as evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment requiring exorcism. Dr. Lozada recognized that the family needed protection beyond what hospital security could provide. He contacted government officials in Lima, arguing that Peru had a moral obligation to shield this child from exploitation. His advocacy reached sympathetic ears within the Ministry of Public Health, where administrators understood that allowing Lina to become a circus attraction would bring international shame upon the nation. They approved a modest financial stipend for the Medina family, enough to cover basic living expenses without requiring them to sell their tragedy to the highest bidder. The arrangement included conditions. The family would relocate to Lima, where anonymity might be possible among the capital's larger population. They would refuse all commercial offers and media interviews. In exchange, the government would provide housing assistance and ensure Gerardo received proper medical monitoring as he grew. For Tiburello and Victoria, accepting charity from a government they had never trusted represented a bitter compromise. But the alternative meant condemning their daughter to a lifetime of public spectacle. Journalists proved relentless despite these protections. They tracked down relatives in Ticrapo, offering money for childhood stories about Lina or speculation about her assault. Some published articles based on fabricated interviews, inventing quotes and details to satisfy editors demanding fresh content about the sensational case. The line between legitimate medical reporting and tabloid exploitation blurred as publications competed for readers drawn to stories of the macabre and unnatural. In late July, the family departed Pisco under cover of darkness, traveling to Lima in a vehicle provided by government officials. They left behind the hospital that had saved both Lina and Gerardo, but also the city where their privacy had been destroyed. Dr. Lozada watched them leave with mixed emotions. He had preserved their lives through medical intervention, yet could not shield them from a world determined to treat human tragedy as entertainment. His final words to Victoria emphasized vigilance. The commercial interest in Lina's story would not fade quickly, and those seeking profit from her suffering would continue pursuing the family for years to come. The media attention gradually subsided as other stories captured public interest, but the damage to Lina's childhood had already been done. She could never attend school without risk of recognition, never play in public parks without strangers staring and whispering. The pregnancy had stolen her innocence in the most violent way possible, and the media circus that followed had stolen whatever remained of her right to a normal childhood. The apartment in Lima's Barrios Altos district occupied the second floor of a crumbling colonial building where water stains mapped decades of neglect across plaster walls. 3 rooms housed the Medina family in their new life, far from Ticrapo's mountain isolation, but carrying its secrets like physical weight. Victoria hung curtains across the windows facing the street, creating barriers against curious eyes that might recognize the girl whose photograph had appeared in newspapers from Buenos Aires to Mexico City. Lina attended the neighborhood primary school under a surname not her own, a precaution arranged through government officials who understood that anonymity represented the only protection they could offer. Teachers received instructions to ask no questions about the child's background, to treat her as they would any student whose family had migrated from the highlands, seeking better opportunities in the capital. She sat in the back row of the classroom, small for her age, even at 7, her attention drifting toward the window while other children recited multiplication tables. In the apartment's cramped bedroom, a wooden crib stood against one wall, positioned close enough that Lina could reach through the slats to touch her son when he cried at night. Gerardo had passed his first birthday in May of 1940, celebrated with a small cake Victoria baked using rationed sugar and flour. The child possessed his mother's dark eyes and the robust health Dr. Lozada had monitored through quarterly examinations, each visit confirming normal development despite the extraordinary circumstances of his birth. After school, Lina returned to the apartment where Victoria had prepared simple meals of rice and beans, occasionally supplemented with fish purchased from street vendors who carried their catches through the neighborhood in wooden carts. The girl changed from her school uniform into worn cotton dresses, then sat on the floor beside Gerardo's playpen. She dressed cornhusk dolls while he grasped at wooden blocks, 2 children occupying the same space with only biology, distinguishing mother from sister. When neighbors asked about the baby, Victoria explained he was her youngest child. Lina maintained this fiction with practiced ease, understanding that truth threatened their fragile stability. She called Gerardo her brother in conversations with schoolmates, described helping her mother care for the infant with the casual tone of an older sibling. Dr. Edmundo Escomel conducted follow-up examinations every 6 months, traveling from his practice in Lima's medical district to the modest clinic where the Medina family received care. His records, preserved in medical archives, documented Lina's physical recovery from the cesarean section. The surgical scar had healed cleanly, leaving only a thin line across her lower abdomen. Her height and weight tracked normal growth curves for girls her age, her body returning to the developmental trajectory it should never have abandoned. The psychiatric evaluations revealed different patterns. Dr. Alejandro Hurtado, assigned by the Ministry of Public Health to monitor Lina's psychological adjustment, noted her responses to questions about the pregnancy carried the flat effect of severe dissociation. When he asked about her time in Pisco, about the hospital or the surgery, she described the experience as if recounting events that had happened to someone else entirely. Her words came slowly, carefully chosen, describing sensations and images without emotional connection to their meaning. During one session documented in Dr. Hurtado's case files, he presented Lina with simple drawings meant to elicit responses about family relationships and emotional attachments. She drew stick figures representing her parents and siblings, placing them in neat rows across the page. When asked to include herself, she added a figure standing apart from the others, smaller and positioned at the paper's edge. Asked about Gerardo, she drew him beside Victoria, not beside her own figure, reflecting the family narrative, but also revealing her emotional distance from motherhood she could not comprehend. Tiburello found work as a silversmith in one of Lima's colonial-era workshops, his skilled hands producing religious items for churches across the city. The wages barely covered rent and food, supplemented by the government stipend that arrived monthly in discreet envelopes. He left early each morning and returned after dark, his silence about their circumstances absolute. The investigation in Pisco had ended without resolution, leaving suspicion, but no answers. And he carried that failure as visibly as the calluses on his fingers from metalwork. Through those years, Gerardo developed with the uncomplicated health of any urban child. He spoke his first words at 13 months, took his first steps at 15. Lina watched these milestones with the detached interest of a child observing a younger sibling's progress, noting but not celebrating, present but fundamentally separated from maternal investment. She fed him when Victoria asked, changed his clothing when instructed, performed the mechanical tasks of childcare without the emotional architecture that should have supported them. The family existed in careful equilibrium, each member maintaining their assigned position in the fiction that protected them from a world still fascinated by their tragedy. Lina's childhood proceeded alongside Gerardo's infancy, two developmental timelines running parallel in the cramped apartment where secrets weighed heavier than poverty, and silence offered the only defense against questions no one could safely answer. The schoolyard confrontation occurred during lunch break on a Tuesday in March of 1949. Three boys cornered Gerardo near the playground fence, clutching yellowed newspaper clippings one had discovered in his grandfather's belongings. The photographs showed a small girl with swollen abdomen, headlines declaring her the youngest confirmed mother in recorded history. They demanded explanations, their accusations carrying the cruel precision of children wielding adult secrets as weapons. Gerardo fled without waiting for dismissal, running through Lima's streets until his lungs burned. He burst through the apartment door where Victoria sat mending clothing, tears streaming down his face, crumpled newspaper pages clutched in his fist. The moment she had dreaded for a decade had arrived. Victoria called for Lina, who emerged from studying for her secondary school examinations. At 16, she had grown into a reserved young woman whose quiet demeanor kept others at distance. She saw Gerardo's tears, the scattered clippings, her mother's stricken expression, and understood immediately what had collapsed around them. The conversation that followed, later documented in family correspondence reviewed by medical social workers, lasted through afternoon into evening. Lina sat beside Gerardo on the worn sofa as she attempted to explain circumstances that remained incomprehensible even to her. She told him about the hospital in Pisco, about doctors she barely remembered, about waking from surgery with inexplicable pain and a crying infant who meant nothing to her child's mind. She explained that someone had hurt her when she was 5 years old, that her body had matured before her mind could understand what such maturity meant. Her voice remained steady, clinical, as if recounting medical history rather than personal trauma. Gerardo listened without interrupting, processing information that rewrote his understanding of family and identity. The woman he had called sister had carried him when she was scarcely older than he was now. His existence resulted from a crime so profound that language struggled to contain it. When Lina finished, silence filled the apartment. Gerardo finally asked the question that would haunt him. Who had done this to her? Lina shook her head. She didn't know, had never known. The memories existed only in fragments too scattered to form coherent narrative. Police had investigated endlessly without discovering truth that remained buried in her inaccessible past. What emerged in subsequent weeks, documented by social workers who visited monthly, was Gerardo's reconstruction of his relationship with Lina. He began calling her his mother in private while maintaining the sister fiction publicly. Medical social worker Elena Vargas noted how Gerardo positioned himself between Lina and strangers, walked her home from school, though she was 6 years older, assumed protective responsibilities typically belonging to fathers or older brothers. His understanding that she had been violated before possessing language to describe what happened before comprehending what bodies were for beyond childhood play, created fierce protectiveness that inverted their supposed sibling relationship. The revelation that should have destroyed their bond, instead, clarified it, stripping away pretense to expose the tragedy they shared as mother and son, both victims of an unnamed perpetrator whose identity remained concealed behind silence. The newspaper clippings burned in the apartment's small stove, their ashes drifting across Lima's rooftops. But the truth they carried could not be destroyed, and the family's careful fiction had finally collapsed under the weight of a past that refused to remain buried. The bone marrow disease manifested slowly through 1978, beginning with fatigue that Gerardo attributed to long hours repairing engines in the automotive shop where he had worked for 15 years. By autumn, bruising appeared across his arms and legs, without corresponding injuries, dark purple marks that spread like stains across his skin. His wife noticed the exhaustion first, how he returned home each evening, moving as though weighted by invisible burdens, collapsing into sleep before dinner finished cooking. In January of '79, physicians at Lima's hospital Dos de Mayo confirmed what preliminary blood tests had suggested. The bone marrow had ceased producing healthy cells at the rate necessary to sustain life, a failure of the body's most fundamental regenerative processes. Treatment options existed, but offered minimal hope given the disease's advanced progression. Case file documentation noted no apparent connection between his condition and the circumstances of his birth, simply the cruel randomness of cellular malfunction that could afflict anyone, regardless of their origin. Gerardo died on a morning when fog obscured Lima's streets, the humidity settling over the city like mourning made tangible. Lina stood beside his hospital bed at 46 years old, her hand resting on his as the monitors recorded the final cessation of vital functions. Raul Jurado, her husband of 7 years, stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder, offering the only comfort possible in a moment that defied consolation. The loss devastated Lina in ways that transcended typical maternal grief. She had carried this man inside her body when she herself was barely more than an infant, had raised him as sibling while biology insisted on different terminology, had watched him transform from victim to protector as truth replaced fiction. His death represented not just the loss of a son, but the severing of the only bond that connected her to that incomprehensible period when her childhood and motherhood had collided impossibly. Raul had known Lina's complete history when they married in '72. He managed his family's printing business in a Lima suburb, offering employment to a woman whose past made conventional social integration nearly impossible. Their courtship proceeded slowly, built on his patient acceptance of silence around topics that remained too painful for articulation. He asked no questions about 1939, about Pisco or investigations or newspaper photographs, understanding that her survival depended on leaving certain doors permanently closed. Their son arrived later in '72 through pregnancy and delivery that proceeded with unremarkable normalcy. Physicians documented every stage with careful attention, noting that Lina's reproductive system had developed typically, despite the precocious puberty that had devastated her childhood. Her body, given time to mature naturally, functioned according to expected patterns rather than the catastrophic acceleration that had enabled her violation to produce pregnancy. Lina worked in the printing shop operating machinery that transferred ink to paper, creating wedding invitations and business cards for customers who never recognized the woman handling their orders. She preferred the mechanical precision of the work, tasks that required attention without emotional investment, producing tangible results that began and ended within predictable time frames. Anonymity represented the only peace she had ever known. Researchers and journalists periodically tracked her through government records and medical archives, appearing at the shop or her home with requests for interviews about the case that had made her internationally infamous. Each inquiry received identical response: polite but absolute refusal. She had nothing to say about events she could not fully remember, about trauma that existed in fragments too scattered to form coherent narrative. Her silence protected her second son from the scrutiny that had defined Gerardo's life, preserving the fragile peace she had built. Through the decades that followed Gerardo's death, the inquiries never ceased entirely. Journalists appeared at irregular intervals, each generation discovering the case anew through medical archives or sensationalized retrospectives about biological anomalies. They arrived at the printing shop with recording devices and contracts, promising financial compensation for exclusive interviews, offering sums that would have transformed Lina's modest circumstances. She refused them all with the same quiet firmness that had characterized her response to unwanted attention since childhood. In the 1990s, when Lina entered her 60s, a team of forensic psychologists from the United States requested permission to conduct interviews aimed at recovering suppressed memories through therapeutic techniques. They proposed hypnosis, carefully structured questioning protocols, methods they insisted could unlock information buried in her subconscious since 1938. Their letter, preserved in academic correspondence files, emphasized the importance of identifying her abuser, not just for historical record, but as potential breakthrough in understanding how childhood trauma affects long-term memory formation. Lina's response, delivered through her attorney, consisted of 2 sentences. She had no memories to recover and no interest in attempts to create them through psychological intervention. The finality of her refusal left no room for negotiation or persuasion, closing yet another avenue for those seeking answers she either could not or would not provide. The case file in Pisco, transferred eventually to digital archives maintained by Peru's Ministry of Justice, remained officially unsolved. Inspector Hurtado's reports from 1939 documented the investigation's failure with bureaucratic precision, noting witness statements that led nowhere, evidence that never materialized, suspects released for lack of proof. The statute of limitations had expired decades before anyone seriously considered reopening the investigation, rendering academic the question of whether sufficient evidence could ever have supported prosecution. Legal scholars and medical ethicists incorporated Lina's case into academic curricula, using it to illustrate systemic failures in protecting vulnerable children. Conference presentations and journal articles analyzed how geographic isolation, cultural barriers, and inadequate investigative resources had combined to ensure that whoever violated a 5-year-old girl in an Andean village faced no consequences. Her case became shorthand for the thousands of children whose abuse occurs beyond the reach of social services and legal oversight, crimes that remain hidden until physical evidence makes concealment impossible. Child protection advocates cited her story in arguments for expanded rural health care access and mandatory reporting protocols. They pointed to the months Lina's pregnancy progressed without intervention, to the family's initial reliance on traditional healers rather than medical professionals, to the investigation hampered by community silence and primitive forensic capabilities. Her suffering became data supporting policy reforms she would never personally benefit from. Her trauma transformed into cautionary tale for future generations. As Lina entered her 90s in the 21st century, living quietly in a Lima neighborhood where few residents knew her history, the fundamental question remained unanswered. Who had violated this child before she possessed language adequate to describe violation, before she understood that bodies contained reproductive capacity, before she could comprehend that adults might harm rather than protect? Theories proliferated across decades. Some investigators believed her father Tiburello bore responsibility despite his alibis, arguing that family members often escape suspicion through communal protection. Others suggested transient workers or visitors to Ticrapo during festival periods, anonymous predators who vanished before consequences materialized. A few proposed that her extreme precocious puberty might have prompted assault by someone who mistook her physical development for maturity, though this theory offered explanation rather than exoneration. Lina's silence preserved multiple possibilities. Perhaps she genuinely could not remember, the trauma occurring before her mind developed mechanisms for processing such experiences into retrievable memory. Perhaps she remembered, but chose protection over revelation, shielding a family member or community figure whose identification would destroy relationships she valued more than justice. Perhaps the truth existed somewhere between memory and forgetting, in fragments too painful to assemble into coherent narrative even after 8 decades. The medical records endured where memory failed. X-rays showing fetal development in a 5-year-old's body, surgical notes describing the cesarean section that defied natural possibility, hormone panels documenting puberty that should never have occurred. These artifacts testified to biological reality while remaining silent about human agency, confirming that pregnancy happened without identifying who caused it. In her final years, Lina maintained the reserve that had protected her since Pisco. She attended family gatherings, celebrated her second son's achievements, lived the ordinary life she had fought for across 9 decades. When asked about 1939, her expression closed like a door, polite but absolute in its refusal to open. The world could study her medical history, debate her case in academic forums, transform her into symbol and statistic, but the one truth that mattered most remained hers alone to withhold. Justice for Lina Medina existed only as absence, as question mark preserved in unsolved case files and unanswered inquiries. Her silence protected either a memory or a person, shielding truths that no 5-year-old should ever have had to carry. The case that had made her the youngest confirmed mother in medical history would close without resolution, carrying its essential secret into whatever darkness receives the truths we cannot bear to speak. If you found this story as haunting as I did, please like and subscribe for more explorations into history's most unsettling mysteries. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Lina's story, and whether you believe her silence was protective or simply the result of trauma too profound to remember. Your engagement helps ensure these forgotten stories continue to reach people who need to hear them.